Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, published by Basic Books. Law professor Derrick Bell is one of our movement's giants, one of our true heroes. Historian Henry Louis Gates, Jr. has said it is, by turns, energizing and infuriating. And Professor Gates is right on target when he notes that this is a book that readers will want to fling across the room or pore over with assiduous care. That a reader would be left indifferent, however, is unimaginable. Indeed, I dare say that nothing my guest could write or do or say would ever leave one indifferent, including his likely response to my asking right off what in the world he means by writing, "The challenge throughout has been to tell what I view as the truth about racism without causing disabling despair." What do you mean?
It seems to me that both history, my experience, current events as we read them, all point to one conclusion about racism in this society. And that, Mr. Hefner, is that it is permanent. That it is an essential, it is not an aberration, it is not what most of us believed it was 30, 40 years ago. A pimple on an otherwise beautiful complexion of America as a place of freedom and equality for all. We all believed that at one time. That was the Gunnar Myrdal report, the huge study of racial discrimination in the 40s, and we all accepted that. As a litigator, I acted on that belief, and I think, though, that even though it means tearing down in a way much of what I've done, much of what others have done, that we have to, on the tatters of what we thought would be a wonderful edifice, in the ruins, we have to see what there is to be seen. And that leads me to that conclusion.
Yes, but how can you use the phrase without despair? Because what you're saying inevitably leads to despair, and inevitably is an interesting word because you seem to have adopted a determinism here that cuts out room for anything other than despair.
Well, I think folk have heard from the master in terms of turning poetry into good common sense with regard to our people. Let me just talk about a few things. People saying when Barack Obama became president, that was the end of the old era. This, he said, would be the post-racial era. Now, it was important. There's no doubt, and I agree with Hawkey that I was one who felt not during my lifetime would it ever happen. It happened for the same reason the Emancipation Proclamation happened, that the Civil Rights post-Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution happened, the same reason Brown v. Board happened, the same reason that affirmative action happened. It happened because white folk, usually small groups, the Supreme Court here or executive there, decided that what we were pushing for, fighting for, praying for, if we at least recognize it, the folk in charge, it would be of benefit to them and to the country. Without that benefit, none of those things would have happened. Brown v. Board is really an anti-communist decision, not a equality decision. And usually after I call it interest convergence, when the interests of white folk converge with that of blacks, then some progress happens. Now there's also interest divergence, because after a little while, the folk that didn't want it to happen anyhow decided to rise up. The people who helped make it happen back down. That's Brown v. Board, isn't it? Right. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. The same thing happened with Barack.
I certainly have to acknowledge it, the temptation to despair that this leads, because it's so different from that we have followed and believed. The fact is, though, that to continue on with those beliefs leads to a more definite despair. Moreover, it does not provide any insight on where we should go from here. I think that there is something that has that stuff of revival about truth. The truth of individuals who learn that they have terminal cancer.
Now, how did this one man do all this? How's he accomplished all this? He hasn't done it simply by his good looks and easy charm. Although he has both in ample measure. He hasn't done it simply because of the excellence of his scholarship. Although his scholarship has opened up new vistas and new horizons and changed the standards of what legal writing is about. Open up your hearts and your minds to the words of Professor Derrick Bell.
Barack was a brilliant a politician, a very smart man, had a great campaign, and the country was in a mess.
There's only one correction. I appreciate your applause. I appreciate Barack's kind words, but it was not me that made all of this possible. I want you to understand that while I have been here for 2 decades, I have not forgotten that my appointment represented the culmination of years of student struggle. I remember as well that for the first 150 years of its history, the faculty at Harvard Law, the oldest existing, most prestigious, and in the view of many, the best law school in the United States, was all white and all male. That is a horrible history, not remediable by plaintive pleas of mea culpa, combined with the token appointment of members of the victim class who are least likely to remind the school of its past racist hiring record. Unique political and cultural perspectives of those this society places in subordinate status based on their race, gender, sexual orientation, and physical handicap. Unfortunately, those minorities most likely to have these skills are often not attractive to those who believe that a law faculty hired using the standards of the 1950s should serve the needs of the 1990s.
They have terminal cancer. For some, they jump out the window. For many others, though, after they get themselves together, they live, in whatever time they have, more purposeful lives. Why? Because they have gotten beyond that afflicts us all at one level or another, which is the belief that, well, death is something that happens to somebody else, but it's not going to happen to me. And we live our lives often enough as though we're going to be here permanently and waste an awful lot of our lives. I think that there's a similar situation with regard to our commitment to racial equality.
Barack was a brilliant a politician, a very smart man, had a great campaign, and the country was in a mess. And it was partly in a mess because of the person he was running against, who would help put it in a mess. So instead of a small group, a whole lot of white folk decided, whoa, I guess we'll go with the young black guy. And they voted for him, interest convergence. We wanted him to be elected. Many of them, now majority of white folks voted against him, but that's another story. We'll talk about that another time. And he was elected. That was interest convergence. But having been elected, just as with Brown, just as the Emancipation Proclamation, folk then got nervous. What is black man doing in the White House? Suddenly people wanted small government. Suddenly they wanted to take their country back. They didn't want to take the country back during Bush, who was taking them every way but right. No, suddenly they want to get the country back. So that we are now not in the post racism era, but rather in an era in which racism has been resurrected.
With regard to our commitment to racial equality.
But black and white and yellow and whatever other color you can think of will be here permanently. So the metaphor you use there is, it seems to me, one that is lacking, because you're quite correct. You deal with the reality of your coming death. I must, you must, one who has cancer today must. But you know that there is an end to it. Are you suggesting that there is an end to, a deadly end to the relations between the races?
I think that the analogy, as you're pointing out, is not a perfect one. But I think it is helpful in that individuals, when they face up to the reality of their death, are able to live more purposeful lives. If we face up to the reality of racism and the role it plays in the society, that it's not simply an aberration, that it's a necessary stabilizing influence in a society like ours, that doesn't mean that we give up. It means that we are able to face the real problems, the real enemy, if you will, and to fashion tactics and strategies that are likely to be more effective. Not guaranteed, not likely even to bring about the kind of era we thought about when we sang "We Shall Overcome," but likely to be a more meaningful, lead to more meaningful endeavor than we're now engaged in.
But you know, I'm sorry to push you on this and pursue it, but when you say a more meaningful endeavor, you seem first to have posited an end, and to have said to me in reading Faces at the Bottom of the Well, unless you can interpret now for me something different, you can help me see some chance for change, you seem to be saying, there are those faces. They are not going to be changed. When you say, at least we can recognize the enemy, it's a little pogo-ish. Seeing the enemy, and it is we.
To the extent that we continue in our own direction, often enough it is us.
What will change?
I think that that our attitude with regard to where we're going, what we're doing, right now, or in the last few months, there's been a lot of controversy about the worth of all male, necessarily black schools in the inner city as a means of dealing with the genocidal situation that is facing so many of our young black males. Many of those who held the original dream of integration, both racially and certainly gender-wise, have been very troubled by that, have opposed it. Some organizations have gone into court to actually halt programs. Well, I think that is at least mischievous and perhaps more dangerous than that, because it is not allowing a potentially effective procedure to even be tried. And we can repeat that example in many other areas of the civil rights struggle. To continue in the same way, I think is a mistake. That if you ask me, well, what should we be doing differently? I can't give you a blueprint. If I could, I would have written a better book than Faces at the Bottom of the Well. But I can say that once we adopt a different outlook with regard to the causes of racism, how we deal with it, I think then that individuals, particularly in their own areas of education or employment or whatever it is, will be able to fashion ideas that make more sense in our present world.
Professor Bell, let me ask this question. Do you think that we're black and white strong enough to face this concept of the permanence of racism? Strong enough?
I guess I don't know. My proselytizing has with it the hope that we will be. Otherwise, we are condemned to repeat a series of patterns that I can trace back for 300 years.
Been resurrected, you see, and there is. I wish the president recognized that more than he did. Although if he recognized it too much, he wouldn't have got elected and wouldn't stay elected. So I cut him some slack. I can't think of anybody who could do it better. And the country is still in a mess. And for the first time in history, as far as I know, the whole of the other party is opposed. They want him to fail. Right. I've never heard of that. They may be opposed. This one.
Now, earlier this week, courtesy of Breitbart.com, we aired a rare piece of video from a 1991 protest showing Harvard student Barack Obama introducing a man by the name of Derrick Bell. Now, in case you missed it, here it is.
And I remember that the black law students had organized an orientation for the first-year students. And one of the persons who spoke at that orientation was Professor Bell. And I remember him sauntering up to the front and not giving us a lecture, but engaging us in a conversation. Open up your hearts and your minds to the words of Professor Derrick Bell.
Let's do as we were told and open our hearts and minds to the words of this controversial figure. Now, here he is talking about what it was that kept an old friend of his motivated during a time when racial tension was running high in the 1960s.
He traced back what he would consider, to a certain degree, the permanence, or at least the widespread nature of racism, to the fact of slavery. Blacks came to this country as slaves, and that is the way Americans continue to see them. You go further. What is basic to your thinking? What is your fix on the nature of human nature that leads you to write about the permanence of racism? What do we like?
There's something about humans, because as many of my critics often point out, some of my students point out, that the United States is not unique in its willingness to subordinate a identifiable minority, either minority identifiable by race, by religion, by ethnic grouping. That's a worldwide phenomenon. What would seem to make it different here is our commitment from our earliest documents, the Constitution and what have you, that seem at one level to be pointing in a different direction. When read carefully, of course, already inculcate some of the essence of the problems that we face today.
Well, the compromises in the Constitution certainly put their stamp.
That's absolutely
on
right.
Racist attitudes.
And we have, as a matter of fact, we mentioned slavery. No whites were ever enslaved. That is, that the essence of slavery was a belief by whites that blacks could be reduced to slavery, and that would be somehow beneficial to them. It certainly was going to be necessary to move the society along. Segregation, when slavery was replaced, no whites have ever been segregated in the way that blacks have. And again, that policy came about as a compromise needed to move whites of differing views, differing politics ahead. So that if you look at almost any of the either positives or negatives in terms of the racial policy in this country, you will find that at bottom, whatever has been said, it was intended to further the ends of whites, often differing whites on a particular issue.
Would you be willing to modify the permanence of racism to the permanence of exploitation, to the permanence of some other concept that would mean that there will always be a bottom rung on the ladder and will be on one rung up?
I guess...
Isn't it oppression rather than racism?
Well, oppression is certainly the essence, but in our society, the oppression and blacks have the two concepts have come together
because of slavery.
But again, slavery itself was a manifestation of this deep sense of white superiority, and that blacks, while we would like them to be treated better, if there's we have to make a decision between treating better and not treating better, then we're going to... Lincoln was certainly the example when he wrote back to Horace Greeley with regard to slavery, that I will do, he said, anything I have to do to save the Union. If I can save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I'll do that. Keeping them all in slavery, I'll do that. Freeing some, leaving some in slavery, I'll do that. Whatever it takes. I love that quote because it reflects his candid nature, but it also reflects American policy making both before and after Lincoln.
Yes, spoken by one who saw inevitably the death of slavery, who saw inevitably the uneconomic nature of slavery. So that, you're right, he wrote in the summer of '62, whatever I do will preserve the Union, I will do to preserve the Union. But the Union was a means of maintaining something that would permanently stay in place and eventually lead to the end of slavery.
So it's interesting that Lincoln also called black leaders together to the White House right after the war and said, I really think that we should plan to send you back to Africa, because I don't believe, he and Jefferson did not believe that the two people could live together in the same country. And I'm not sure that was because he felt necessarily that blacks were inferior, although that was a general view, but was rather, I wonder whether both of them didn't see this tension, this need to subordinate that this could not be denied.
Does that lead you to be a separatist?
Not entirely. I think that it covers a lot. When you tell me, let's try black male schools, notwithstanding my feminist friends who become appalled, I think it's worth a try. When you tell me about some of the things that the Muslims have been able to do on a separate basis within communities, I think that that's worthwhile. I think that if we could turn our prison systems over to the Muslims or that kind of philosophy, we might be able to bring people out to do other than things that get them right back in.
It's my told that you don't bother to vote so we can stop Muslims undermining our British way of life, using flimsy cover stories.
But if you're talking about let's set up a separate state or what have you, it's already been tried and it doesn't work very well.
The city of Tikrit, here in northern Iraq, is now firmly under the control of American forces. Or is it? These members of the Iraqi resistance movement, still loyal to Saddam Hussein, think otherwise.
The Americans tell lies. Each day our forces grow stronger. Each day we move closer to our goal of driving the infidel... What are they?
Let me come back to the question that I asked you before about the nature of human nature. Is that what it is that we're talking about, the need to oppress, or the need that you may sense of whites to prevail over blacks?
What are they?
Nothing. Carry on.
Driving the infidels from our motherland. We are not afraid to... Are they subtitles?
If that's the case, mustn't blacks feel the same way about whites?
I certainly do not see if we're just talking about Africans, I don't see any lessening of some of these unhappy urges by people of African background when they get power, even over their own people. So I can't say that there's something in the genes that makes one group good and one bad. In this society, though, there are several levels, you see. The fact is that race has always served as a diversion. The piece that I wrote at the beginning of Faces at the Bottom of the Well talks about black people are the faces at the bottom of the societal well. Whites, many of whom occupy a level only slightly above the blacks, reach down and are mesmerized. Some reach out and try to pull us up. They know that unless they help us up, they won't be able to move to the different level. But rather than look up at the top to see who it is that's keeping us both down, they remain fixated on us and determine that they will stay where they are if it means we can stay down further below. Well, there's something of that, and it is encouraged by varying groups at the top because it takes the heat off them. That's George Bush, isn't it?
They are, aren't they?
No.
Well, what do I need subtitles for? Can't you understand what I'm saying? I studied English at the bloody American University in Cairo.
Well, obviously I can understand what you're saying.
Oh,
but
you see how they condescend to us with their subtitles.
Oh, maybe it's teletext, for the hearing impaired.
Teletext?
No, a lot of TVs come with teletext nowadays.
Wait, say something again.
My friend has an 80 cent.
Hey, how come he doesn't need subtitles?
Well, obviously he's comprehensible.
No, I'm not!
We're coming up to another election, but last time Bush, who came into power on Reagan's policies, where there had been a greater growth in the disparity between the upper class and the rest of us, almost in the history of the country, didn't talk about that at all. He talked about waving the flag and talked about the Willie Horton. He moved the focus away from where the problems really are and focused them in one way or another, somewhat more subtly maybe than Reagan, some would say not so much more subtly, on race.
Look, if
I speak perfect English. She sells seashells by the seashore. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Round the ragged rocks,
The situation remains as dangerous and volatile as ever here in northern Iraq. While the rebuilding continues...
What? I can't understand you speak English. Where are your subtitles? Oh, you think you're so good. Look at me. I got the subtitles.
Kerry Downs, Iraq.
Shut up!
And it works every time.
But you seem to be saying that it works every time, not in terms necessarily of Reagan or of Bush or of X or Y or of Z, but in terms of whites and blacks in America.
Oh, sure.
It must work.
The individuals change over time, but the willingness to use race as a detour, as a change of focus away from where the real issues are, has been. That's how slavery got started.
Why do you do it? And she said, Derrick, I'm an old lady. I live to harass white folks. And the marvelous thing about it, the way those neighborhoods, she lived near whites who were supportive of her. So she wasn't talking, it wasn't a racial thing, but she knew that those people who were oppressing her were white. She knew that she didn't have their power, she didn't have their money, she certainly didn't have their guns. But she saw her life as given in trouble, being on the case all the time. And I've accepted that as my motto. I live to harass white folks. So those at Harvard and some of the other places need to be on guard.
Now, concern about Bell's radicalism was raised back in 1990 by our next guest, renowned economist and author Thomas Sewell. Now, here's what he had to say about Professor Bell.
Derrick Bell.
Yes.
Harvard Law School, black man.
Yes.
Threatened the law school if they didn't hire a black woman.
Yes.
He's leaving.
Oh no! Well, he's taking. If I understand it correctly, he's taking unpaid leave until such time as they hire a woman of color, as he says. But he's also said that by black he does not mean skin color. He means those who are really black, not those who think white and look black. And so what he's really saying is he wants ideological conformity in the people that are hired to fill this position.
I mean, is he a hero?
To me?
No, basically, I mean, from the press coverage you've seen, is he a hero to the...
Well, he's looked at as an idealist who is self-sacrificing and so on. I suppose one could have, if one wanted to look at it that way, seen Hitler that way in his early days. It's just a question of where that kind of idealism leads. He has launched a despicable attack on a young black professor at the law school who doesn't go along with this.
But the willingness to use race as a detour, as a change of focus away from where the real issues are, has been. That's how slavery got started. Those able to afford slaves were able to convince those whites who could not afford slaves that somehow, even though the presence of slaves meant that the rest of those whites were always going to be in a disadvantaged economic position, that they needed to stay together to avoid, to fight off the slave revolts and all the rest. And we have the same thing today with affirmative action and some of those policies, don't we?
But that's what intrigued me so about this end paragraph, end chapter of yours, absolutely smashing, the space traders, because you point out that if we were offered in this country, and you picture it in the future with economic times even much harsher than they are now, if we were to exile all of the blacks in America, trade them off for goods, for things that we felt we needed, that most Americans would accept that deal with the devil. But you go on to say that there were those who didn't want to be rid of the lower class because that lower class was black, and if we got rid of blacks, then whites would be part of the lower class, of course, which is
certain identifiable members.
Others.
You know, I think traditionally Jews have been scapegoats in society based on religion and culture, and that I'm not so sure that anti-Semitism is so dead in this country that if blacks all disappear, there wouldn't be an effort to revive it to a great extent.
That's what, if you forgive me, bugs me so about Faces at the Bottom of the Well, the permanence of racism, because I find so little hope in it. Now tell me again, what is that mystical connection between recognition of what you want the black community to recognize and a kind of transcending of the despair that there must be? How do we get from here to there?
Fighting against the whites ostensibly, he's also fighting against those blacks who don't agree with him. He really has this sort of totalitarian mindset. It's quite sad because I once had an extended conversation with Professor Bell back in the early 80s, and he's not a stupid man. But you have to understand, Derrick Bell was put in an impossible position. He was hired as a full professor at the Harvard Law School when he himself said that he did not have the kinds of qualifications that people have when they get appointed as full professors at the Harvard Law School. And so what were his options? His options would be a nobody, really, among world-famous intellectuals, or to go off on his own shtick and try to be important or significant in that way. And he chose the low road.
Let me ask you specifically about
the fundamental problem was making him a professor at the Harvard Law School when even he himself knew that that was not something that he merited.
What about this comment that he made here? I've accepted that motto. I live to harass white folk. On another occasion, I played this on my radio today, he talked about, white boys getting tenure. What does it say about him? And as we look at this portrait of Barack Obama and Ayers, Dorn, Wright, Flager, Alinsky, Resco, Acorn, and the way he's governed, what does it tell you about the president?
That he too is not someone who is. He's turned his back on the ideal of a colorblind society, and he's really for a, I guess, a getting even society, a revenge society. And I think that the appointment of Eric Holder and Eric Holder's behavior as Attorney General shows that same mindset. It's very ugly. It's particularly ironic in the case of Bell because at one point in his career he fought against racism, and now he seems to have metamorphosed into someone who thinks that racism should not be eliminated but simply put under new management.
We are here basically to recognize and fight evil, whatever that is. I mean, we certainly want to be successes and support our families, but life the miracle of our lives must be more than a house in the suburbs and a BMW in the driveway, you see. So that if by some miracle racism ended tomorrow, those of us who feel that our lives are to serve others, to find evil and try to deal with it, we would look around and deal with poverty, or we would deal with some horrible disease. So that in some ways, the fact of racism being permanent is not automatically, oh my God, there's no hope. Because our efforts are always to recognize bad stuff. The more important thing, though, I think, is the back to slavery. Because slavery was a horrible time, but it was also a time of magnificent overcoming by any number of the slaves to a situation that must have been much worse than anything we can imagine today. That these people had no rights, that they were chattel, that they could be bought and sold and beaten and killed and raped, and there was no relief. And that must have been very despairing to many. But we know from the history and the legacy of the spirituals that for some, there was a recognition that as bad as their lives were, there was something beyond that. And not simply a hope of a place in heaven. That they had a faith that transcended even their situation. And I think they were able to gain that faith out of an honest recognition of just how bad their situation was. And I'm urging that we look to that model and then try to move on from there.
That's a.
I was thinking about Derrick Bell, but it's also the case. I think it would apply certainly to Eric Holder and perhaps to the president.
What do you mean, perhaps, to the president? You see, for example, I think it's more ideological. You know, actually, the person that I am most concerned that he hung out with more than anybody. I didn't like Reverend Wright at all. I don't know how you sit there for 20 years. GD America's chickens have come home to roost. But I really am frustrated that the media did not vet him in 2008. How do you hang out with an unrepentant terrorist, give speeches with him, start your political career on his home, sit on boards with him, and get asked one question during a campaign season about that? Would that ever happen to a Republican?
Not that I know of, but it's one of those cases where people, they have made up their mind what they want to see in someone. And really, they're going to explain away anything that deviates from that. To try to talk, it's like having a friend who has gotten hooked up with some very bad woman. And the question is, are you going to try to tell him what's wrong with her, which is probably not going to change anything except to lose his friendship. And I think people have that.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think people have that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's all right. I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. You know, in your book, you deal with the issue of race in great detail. And one of the things Professor Bell said was racism is a permanent part of the American scene. In your book, Intellectuals in Society, you add these new chapters. When he says racism is a permanent part of the American scene, do you agree with that?
No, but I think it's a permanent part of the thinking of people who have a huge vested interest in racism. I think of a phrase used by Dinesh D'Souza a few years ago, that there are many black leaders who publicly claim that racism has not abated, but who privately are worried that it has, because where are they going to be without racism?
I think 35 years ago at this table, Martin Luther King, that in a sense was his message, wasn't it? It was a religious, it was a spiritual message.
I think so, although it translated in the 60s into we're going to end this racism. Blacks and whites are going to sit down together. Well, probably at many levels that happens, and I think it's going to continue to happen. But the kind of forces that we see in our inner cities today, the kind of frustration that I hear as I sit at very fancy dinner parties of black professionals and what have you, that is going to be harder to deal with. The glass ceilings, I was talking earlier about the Michael Jordan phenomenon. Most black professionals, I think, are envious of Michael Jordan, not simply because of his tremendous skills, but the way he exhibits his skills can't be denied. He does it in a way that very few others can do it. For most of us, some of us who think we have skills in writing or in teaching or in business or in government that are the equal of his, it's always easy to kind of shift the credit to somebody else, to not give us the promotion, to not give the full recognition. And it creates just a tremendous frustration. Now, I'm not saying that is anything like the kind of barriers that face black males in the inner city.
Now, you said, and I started off that way, quoting you, that your objective was to get people to understand the realities of racism and without despair. How sanguine are you about the future? Maybe that gives away too much. Maybe it presses you to give it. But in the moment or two we have left, how sanguine are you?
But to want the President of the United States to fail?
I think that I am not sanguine, but I do not despair. The slaves had no reason to be sanguine about what was going to happen. They hoped for freedom. We hope things are going to be better. But all of the indicators point in another direction. That is a reason, though, for recommitment in keeping with the miracle of our existence, our responsibilities, what makes us feel good about life. And that is fighting the struggle. Let me end with a quick story about an old woman down in rural Mississippi who I asked a question like this because she was pushing and
I loved her answer.
And they were shooting through her house at night. They were trying to take her farm. And I said, you know, Ms. McDonald, why do you do it? And she said, Derrick, I'm an old lady. I lives to harass white folks. Now, this Mrs. McDonald, as a matter of fact, lived in a basically white community, and her neighbors were very supportive of her. So she wasn't condemning all white people. But those who were on her, were oppressing her, her talent was not to beat them, because they had the money, the power, the guns. Her determination was, in her words, to harass them. And to get from that harassment, whether she recognized it or not, a kind of existential triumph.
My grandmother used to say, take a lesson. It seems to me you've taken a lesson, and that seems to be your motivation in life, in your profession.
But to want the United States to fail?
Is that fair?
I think that's fair.
Professor Derrick Bell, I do appreciate you joining me today, and I think that Faces at the Bottom of the Well, again, particularly that very last segment, particularly intriguing. One question, yes or no? The book aimed essentially at blacks or whites?
Oh, I need to answer quickly. I want to quote Bell Hooks, the black writer, who said the great frustration that she feels is to write for black people and find her editors and her publishers and everyone else assume that the first readers will be privileged whites.
Thank you so much again for joining me today. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you'd like to share your thoughts about our program today, please write.
What is that all about? But there is a message, and as Hoppy said, the truth will help make us free. And the truth is that we are still in a racist society. We still have to work very hard to make all of this survival feeling continue to be possible.
Attention, code red. A bank robbery is in progress.
Oh, it is.
And the rat doesn't know how to react, and you do this, okay? And you wind up doing it again, or perhaps again. And if once in a while a rat turns viciously on you and just becomes a total vicious killer, which is really what I was, then don't go passing statements of morality saying, well, this was not warranted.